Right, I can see that we're still getting some attendees coming through now, but I'll start with basically a brief introduction before I hand over for the presentation. First of all, welcome. I'm Zoe, Events Executive at Brand Finance. Thank you for joining the first webinar in our series from the Brand Finance Institute, which is the newly launched educational division of Brand Finance. Through this series of webinars, we'll be primarily exploring topics around brand leadership in times of crisis. Today's webinar will focus on the impact COVID-19 is having on brand value and the challenges that are being presented to brand leaders as a result. The session will be led by Gabi Salinas, who's the Global Managing Director at the Brand Finance Institute, and Parul Soni, Associate at Brand Finance, who I will be handing over to shortly. Just a quick note on housekeeping. The format of the hour-long webinar today will follow approximately 30 to 40-minute presentation from Gabi and Parul, followed by around 15 minutes Q&A session towards the end. We'll be monitoring the chat for any comments or tech issues or any other reported, anything else you'd like to report, etc. We do ask that you submit any questions via the designated Q&A facility, as this will guide us through our discussion at the end of the presentation. Please do feel free to submit any questions throughout the presentation, and of course we'll aim to address as many as possible before the end of the session today. Just to let you know, we will be sharing a recording of the webinar after the session, and further details of the presentation will be included in a white paper, which is written by Gabi, which will be published tomorrow, which is Thursday. We also kindly request on leaving the webinar, you complete a short survey providing feedback, which will be useful in developing future webinars in our series. And of course, any other questions, please do let me know in the Zoom chat throughout the presentation. Otherwise, I'm now happy to hand over to Gabi and Parul. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe, for the introduction. I wanted to welcome all attendees. We have more than 300 people registered from more than 40 countries, among others the UK, US, France, Germany, Russia, Spain, Sri Lanka, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, China, Brazil, and many more. As you know, Zoe mentioned, last week we launched the Brand Finance Institute officially, as we have been working in training for our clients for a long time. But Brand Finance Institute is the educational and training division of Brand Finance, and we offer expert training on brand evaluation, management and strategy. And you're going to see throughout the presentation that what differentiates us is an analytical, well-researched and rigorous approach to brand strategy and for leadership. So I invite you to visit our website, social media channels, to find our latest analysis and white papers on how the situation is affecting brands. So going into the content of the presentation and how we're going to structure it. Basically, since the onset of the crisis caused by the coronavirus pandemic, there are two questions that usually our clients ask us, which is what they should do and shouldn't do now, and what will happen when all of this is over. To try to answer to these questions, what we're going to review through this presentation is how the crisis is affecting the brands now, but also the likely stages of this crisis and how brands should be reacting in each one of these stages, the impact that this is having on brand value at global, sectorial, and individual level, and how brands should communicate and react to protect brand value. So, in short, our clients want to know what they must do today so that given the future that we're anticipating, they can emerge stronger from the crisis and mitigate the risk of loss of brand value. So I don't know about you, but in recent weeks, I lost count of all the many articles that predict how different the cities in which we will live, the way in which we will work, and the consumer habits will be after the coronavirus. So they all predict that this is going to be, all of this is going to be radically different. But I love this phrase from a Danish physicist that once said, it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. And I think this is now more true than ever, because we are living in an environment in which regulation, decrees, government decisions change several times in a week and sometimes in a day. But most big corporations are planning in 3 horizons. In particular, strict social distancing, which is what we're facing now, a period of graduating or gradual lifting of the lockdown, and a new normal or an old normal, depending in which group you are. People that think that our life post-COVID is going to be radically different, and people that think it ain't going to change that much. So going to the first stage, during the pandemic and the lockdown, we have witnessed first some undesirable hoarding behaviors, and I think we have seen like three fevers in terms of hoarding. First, the fever of the toilet paper, then the fever of the flour, and now more recently the fever of the hair dye. But together with that, we have seen how we have quickly adapted to online shopping. We consume more entertainment online, and definitely how we are adapting, not without difficulty, to remote working. I'm not sure how many working moms and dads are among our audience. I imagine quite a few, but these memes represent my daily life quite well. I had to adapt very quickly to combine working from home, helping kids with homeschool, their homework, housework, and all of these can be at times quite challenging for all of us. And but basically, all these changes, what they have done, they have accelerated trends that were already there before the pandemic, and among others, they have accelerated digital transformation. But also, and I think with the lockdown and the hard stop on activity in many sectors, and terminations and furloughs on the rise, consumers are retracting expenses, and this is forcing corporations to adjust budgets, and many brands are going to or have gone dark or fallen into a temptation of communicating an indistinct and irrelevant way. And also another risk for brands is the rise of secondary markets for falsifications, in particular in those sectors that have grown during the crisis, like PPE equipment, that requires closer monitorization of those risks. Then there is a second phase in the pandemic, which is the gradual lifting of governmental restrictions that will be followed by a profound recession. We don't know how long it's going to last, but it's likely that brands, during the recession, again, they cut budgets, and towards the end of the recession, they will slowly re-engage and try to boost consumption with positive messages. This is what Mark Ritson called false pneuma, and they will try to get us into the mood of consuming again. It's also likely that a lot of us are going to engage in what experts call revenge consumption, so we will spend significantly during the first weeks and months of the phase two. And then in the third phase of the crisis, and once restrictions are fully lifted and the financial situation improves, consumer and brands will slowly go back to normal. And there are two distinct clusters of thinkers, that in terms of what is going to happen, after the restrictions are lifted. And the first group of historians and philosophers like Harari that think the world after the coronavirus is going to be radically different. And there is a second group, and among them Dyer, and they say, the world will change, but it won't change forever. It will change for a long time, but we will go back to be what we were. The basics, instincts of that are underlying consumer behavior are going to stay there. We're still going to want the same things, and everything is going to go back to normal. If other plagues, other wars didn't change, those basic consumer trends, it's not going to change now. And if we take a look at what is happening in China, and we take this as an evidence or a signal of what it may happen in the future. 10 days ago, when they lifted restrictions, an Hermès boutique in China made 2.7 million in the day after they reopened. So this is a sign of what it may happen. Maybe things are going to go back to normal. Not maybe in the next 18 months, but probably shortly after that. So to summarize, this first section of the presentation, we are envisaging three stages in the pandemic: the short term, medium term, long term, and during these three stages, the brand reactions probably are going to be either going dark or communicating in an irrelevant, indistinct way. then they're going to slowly re-engage, and probably after a significant period, it could be anything between 18 to 36 months, going back to normal in terms of budgets and communications. And also in terms of what we can learn from past crises in order to best manage our brand during these three stages of the pandemic. I love this phrase from Winston Churchill that once said, the further back you can look, the farther forward you're likely to see. And I think it's important to understand there are so many lessons that are buried in historic crises, and we need to learn from them, not to repeat the same mistakes that other brands have incurred during past financial crises. So in this section, we will review some publications and studies that illustrate two lessons in particular: the link between brand strength and business performance during a crisis, and the link between brand investment and brand strength during a crisis. So, if we look at the past crisis, we have conducted analysis on the sectors that have been most affected during the 2008 crisis in terms of negative impact on brand value. And we can see how beers, retail, food were the least affected, financial services, cosmetic, pharma, the most affected. And within these sectors, we analyze different brands, because not all brands perform equally within these sectors. So our analysis revealed that the stronger brands have performed better during the recessions. And in fact, we analyzed the recessions of 2008, 12, and 16. What we saw during those crises is that the consistent winners had an average brand strength of 72 versus the consistent fallers that had an average brand strength of 66. So what we learned is that stronger brands perform better in terms of financial performance during crises. But then how do you leverage your brand strength during a crisis? So in order to look at that, we look at the behavior of many brands, and what we see is that because consumers cut down their expenses, they do the same, and in particular they do it because they emphasize the maximization of short-term sales, and they do it through promotions. Why do they do this? Why they cut down marketing spend? Because it's easy, because they don't consider brand as a long-term asset, because a lot of brand marketing directors think that you can turn on and off marketing investment without any long-term repercussion, because generally the performance metrics that marketers use, if they use any at all, are not linked to value creation. So it's very difficult to justify the maintenance or the increase of the budgets of marketing during a crisis. And this crisis is not an exception. The Interactive Advertising Bureau said that a quarter of brands have stopped investing in advertising during the first months of 2020 because of budget cuts, fear of appearing opportunistic or offending. What our review of the literature shows is that maintaining or increasing advertising investment during a recession increases market share during the recession and profitability in the long run. And at the base, of this is a relationship that has been studied by Peter Field, which is the relationship between share of voice, so your share in a particular channel, and market share. So if you maintain or increase your share of voice during a crisis, this is going to increase your market share during the recession and impact your long-term profitability. And this is easier to do during a recession because ad costs are low, traffic is up, media consumption is up. And while some brands consistently cut budgets during a recession, there are other brands that have a different philosophy, and one of those is Procter & Gamble. The ex-CEO of Procter & Gamble said in 2008, "We have a philosophy and a strategy. When times are tough, you build market share." They go out and steal market share from the competitors. And they are doing the same in this crisis. Last week, they had an investors call in which they say, "We want to keep our mental availability, and we're going to do this by keeping our share of voice. We are going to keep investing in our brands." And not only that, they are also reviewing their portfolio in order to maximize the effectiveness of their investment. So what can we learn, from all these cases is that, if we reduce investment in a recession, we will only increase short-term profits, and if we maintain our investment or increase our investment in brands during a recession, we're going to impact long-term profitability in a positive way, even when we may be hurt in short-term financial results. So 2 key lessons from past crises: there is a relationship between your marketing investment and your brand strength, and in turn, a relationship between your brand strength and your financial performance. So we have studied this, and now in this section, Parul is going to explain how the crisis is affecting brand value, and she's going to go into more detail on how all these learnings are being repeated in some cases now, and how brands are dealing specifically with specific strategies to react to these risks.
Thank you, Gabi. So as Gabi said, I am Parul. I will be focusing on how the crisis will impact brand values across sectors. To start with, what I will go into is the way that we calculate value at brand finance, brand value at brand finance. Gabi, if you could just move on to the next slide. The way we do this is a 4-step approach. So the approach involves estimating future revenue that's attributable to a brand, and then calculating a royalty rate that would be charged for the use of the brand. The first step in this is starting with an assessment of the strength of the brand that's relative to its peers across a variety of stakeholders, which determines the risk of the brand. So the stronger the brand is, the higher the royalty rate is likely to be able to command on the open market, and the less risky it's perceived to be. The second key factor that forms the crux of brand valuation is the brand's future revenue generating capability, which is both dependent on the availability of the market and also the ability of the brand to service that market. And these are the 2 factors that form the crux of brand valuation, and what I'll be referring to throughout when we're thinking about what the impact of COVID-19 has been on brand value. So on the next slide, what we have is across the world, the pandemic has triggered market crashes. The businesses that have been unable to transition online have come to a complete standstill. And Brand Finance has estimated that the impact of the crisis on 500 of the world's most valuable brands will be close to $1 trillion, which could be lost in value or is value at risk. So the risks that brands face can be categorized into 2 different types. So one is sectorial risk, which is as a result of the sector, the industry, or the category they're in. And the second type is the company-specific risk, which is dependent on business models, operations, the brand's exposure, and its balance sheet, etc. And that's really the type of risk that's been most prominent in this crisis in particular. So first, I will dive into sectoral risks. What we've done is, on the next slide, categorize the impact into 3 levels. So the range of impact depends on the type of product or service of the industry. So essential services and products that aren't severely affected, like utilities, food and drink, household products, telecoms. The demand for these really hasn't diminished significantly due to the lockdown, and so haven't been so severely impacted. The sectors that are of high impact are brands that are worst hit because delayed consumption is not possible, and moving online is also not possible, which has meant that brands in several sectors like restaurants, travel, airlines, holidays, all of these have come to a complete standstill. And once restrictions are lifted, consumption will also not be made up for. And then now if we look at own risks, there are 3 different ways that brands across categories have been impacted. So firstly, there are brands that are thriving in this current environment. So these are the brands that are best placed to cater to our changed lifestyles and demands. So these are companies like online retailers, teleconferencing facilities, and streaming facilities. The second group is the companies that are striving. So these are the companies that are reacting rapidly and adapting. So changing their production processes, repurposing their factories, infrastructures and networks, etc. The final group that we have is companies that are unable to leverage these changing consumption patterns, and these are the ones that are most likely to be in survival mode right now. It's also important to note that because of the nature of the crisis, not all brands within each sector have been impacted equally. So if we look at a high impact, if we look at a limited impact category, so for example, household products, as you see on the screen, there's a big variation in the impact on enterprise value that we're seeing between January and March. So consumers are buying more cleaning products, they're hoarding toilet paper, and this is causing the enterprise value of brands like Clorox and Kimberly-Clark to surge. While on the other end of the spectrum, you have household producers that don't have as much of a focus on what we're classifying as these new essentials that are suffering. So Henkel, for example, has a focus on beauty care, laundry, and home care, which has meant they're continuing to see a decline in their value. Additionally, according to Unilever, they're blaming our lowered grooming standards during this lockdown to lower sales in their personal care products. So the other thing that's interesting to note here is also that Clorox and Kimberly-Clark are also likely to see a delayed decline in their demand, as the people who've been stockpiling and hoarding these products may take time to consume these over the next few months. It's a similar case if we look at a moderate impact category, so tech, for example. On one end, we have Facebook. So although our social media consumption has gone up across all social media, including Facebook, Facebook's revenues are generated majority through advertising, which have dropped. Apple has been forced to close their stores across the globe, and we're seeing a similar impact in companies like Samsung and Google. Zoom, on the other hand, has been booming and has become a brand that's synonymous with video calls at present. In the high impact category, so looking at retail, we see similar differences still. So differences exist across all of these low, moderate, and high impact categories. So while people aren't eating or drinking at restaurants, they're making more meals at homes, and therefore stores like Costco, which are wholesale bulk buying stores, have seen a surge. Tesco and Sainsbury's here in the UK are grocery stores, but they sell more than just groceries. So while their sales of food and essentials have been going up, sales of other products like personal care, clothing, and general household items are on the decline. Similarly, what we see on the other end of the spectrum is JD Sports, a fashion sport retail company, Bed Bath & Beyond, a home store, and M&S, which sells primarily clothes. They've all seen dips in demand. So if we look at companies that are thriving in this crisis, these are the ones that they're doing exceptionally well right now. Although along with this, what they're also seeing is very high levels of public scrutiny. So their actions are being closely followed, and their ability to handle the surge will be key to their long-term success. So, for example, Zoom has seen several companies and governments banning use of their services because of privacy concerns. Vodafone has come under fire for the timing of their UK price hike. Amazon has seen several issues with the treatment of its employees, especially in warehouses and distribution centers. And what this really tells us is that this is a defining moment for these brands, as what they need to try and do is convert these temporary first-time users into loyal long-term users. And managing their reputation through their actions towards all stakeholders should be the focus on their customer experience, and will have a much longer lasting impact than just a temporary surge. This is very clearly evident in the case of Zoom. So while they saw a significant 110% increase in enterprise value between January and March, we saw this very quickly erode just within another 15-20 days as their privacy issues became clear. And now if we look at companies that are striving, so these are companies that are doing it in a few different ways. So the first group is companies that are adapting their products and services. For example, Uber has been accelerating their grocery deliveries, and they've struck deals with several major global retailers to enter into the grocery delivery arena. Bid Food, which is a B2B food supplier, the company has opened its warehouses to consumers for the first time, and they're delivering to consumers to their homes for the first time. Time Out, which is a global media company, covers events, entertainment, culture across cities across the globe. Not only have they creatively rebranded, but they've also modified their product offering to be more relevant. So now they've moved on to reporting on virtual events and streaming things as opposed to physical events. Companies that are adapting their production, so companies like Dyson and several others who've now become part of the contributing to the national effort of producing masks and PPE equipment, ventilators, etc. They're also playing a part. The third group is where they're not able to do any of the others, they're contributing through funds. So MasterCard, Goldman Sachs, Ripper, these are among few of many who've promised donations. And this really has a threefold impact. So firstly, not only is it a means of staying afloat, but it's also a means of societal contribution at a time when it's needed most. And it's also a means of building goodwill. And then we have companies in the survival group, and these are likely to be companies in, for example, the airlines or high street stores, which have, especially those that have very limited presence online and are likely to be in survival mode. So Brand Finance's analysis of the airline sector of ratio of cash to other short-term investments to revenue in 2019 suggested that up to 20 out of top 50 of the largest airlines in the world will only have enough cash to survive another 60 days or less. And of these are 6 out of the top 10 most airline brands in the world. So that industry is especially badly hit. Now, just thinking about in the way that Brand Finance approaches brand value assessment, what we measure is the impact on a broader spectrum of stakeholders more than just customers. And we understand brand equity and reputation in a much broader sense. And therefore, while the availability of demand and the ability of companies to service that has a big impact on brand valuation, so does brand strength. And these two factors don't always move in the same direction. So the brand strength construct covers a variety of different metrics, sorry, just on the previous slide, that are important for a strong brand, from the investment into the brand, perceptions across stakeholders, and the financial impact of these actions, all of which underpin brand value and have an impact on it. And this brand equity and strength is often more difficult to establish and erode than shorter-term financial shocks that are more volatile. An example of a brand that falls into the thriving category is Amazon. And although it's been seeing several new customer signups and has been praised for the essential service that it's carrying out in delivering essentials to households, the brand has also received a lot of negative press around its treatment of workers, lack of protection for them, and its prioritization of profits. The impact of this is that while their revenue performance will see an increase, they will need to carefully manage their reputation. And what we estimate is that their growth is expected to be dampened by the reputation impact. So we estimate the uplift in value for Amazon to be about 2 to 5%. But on the other hand, their brand strength may well see a decline if they're not able to address these concerns that several of their employees are raising and has been covered widely by the media. On the other end of the spectrum, we also have a brand that's in the worst hit category. So luxury Dior, part of the LVMH group, has seen significant praise around its efforts to repurpose their production plants to produce sanitizers, and they've received a lot of praise for their quick action in the media as well. The impact of this has been that while the brand has been struggling with declining sales as they've been forced to close their stores, this financial impact will have a negative impact on their brand value. But again, this will be partially offset by the brand building and reputation improvements that they're seeing through their actions. Now I will pass on to Gabi to cover a third type of risk that is unique to this crisis.
Thank you, Parul, for the presentation. So Parul has reviewed with several examples 2 types of risks that affect brands during a crisis, sectorial and own. But in a crisis of the nature, like the one we are living, we should consider a 3rd type of risk, which is the association with the country of origin. With regional systemic crises, wars or international conflicts, this risk becomes apparent. Joseph Nye, which is an American political scientist and professor, he provided a good example of this when, in the aftermath of the Iraq War, he explained a number of Muslims boycotted Coca-Cola because of its association to American values, and they tend to make a Cola Muslim app as alternatives to this. So this is a very good example of how the association with the country of origin may hurt national brand during the crisis. And this crisis is also, I think, a matter of public diplomacy. There have been a lot of headlines in newspapers that have referred, for example, to the use of mass diplomacy by several countries as a tool to build soft power. And the fact is that corporate brands will be impacted by both how their countries, how their governments handle the crisis, and also diplomatic relations going forward. And we have conducted extensive research on our soft power database, and what we have found is that increasing a nation's soft power index, and we define soft power as the ability to influence the preferences and behaviors of several stakeholders in the international arena. So increasing in 1 percentage point the soft power index of a nation, it has a positive impact on foreign direct investment of $3.6 billion. So definitely, soft power, public diplomacy, and the way governments handle this crisis will impact the value of national brands. So we have seen a myriad of risks that are affecting brands during this crisis, and what we're going to review now is, the question that we're getting from our clients: what should we do now to mitigate those risks and leverage brand value in the long run? So there are 5 types of risk mitigating strategies that are applied in risk management, which are avoid, improve, adjust, retain, and share. And we're going to see how these play out in the world of brand risk management. So the first one, avoid, is what the Interactive Advertising Bureau found, that the quarter of the brands have gone dark and they have avoided investment not to appear as tone deaf or unempathetic, so they avoid communicating. We think that avoiding communicating is not the solution, but that brand leaders should rather carefully consider how to invest. So when you consider how to invest, you need to look at the type of communications, commercial versus social action, which implies a broader understanding of brand investment that goes beyond advertising. You also have to carefully consider your content and subject and the tone of your communications. At the beginning of the pandemic, McDonald's started with this trend or this movement. A lot of brands, leading brands, separated the elements of their logo to signal to the public, the need of social distance. A lot of these initiatives, a lot of brands have gone into this, from Coca-Cola, Salesforce in professional services, Audi, Nike, and the reaction wasn't very good. It wasn't very well received in social media. Some of them, McDonald's ended up apologizing for this. And I think this is logical because, the first thing that came to mind when I saw these kind of initiatives is this all what a leading global brand can do to help us, and this is all what they have to say in the middle of the pandemic. But on the other hand, we had other brands, like, for example, Ford, that in a matter of days, they scrapped all the campaigns that they had planned for the US market and came up with new campaigns, that had these slogans: built for right now, built to lend a hand, that were backing or were amplifying the message that they were doing, new things. And for example, payment relief for clients, they were donating money to support food programs for children not attending school, among other things. So I think these are good examples of, how brands should communicate during the crisis, and they should amplify messages that are relevant for the clients or for the society in general. So I think brands at this juncture are faced with either, placing emphasis on action or placing emphasis on words. And we have seen a lot of examples, at the beginning of this section, of brands that have placed emphasis on words, like, the social distancing branding brands, McDonald's, Nike, Audi, and some others that have put emphasis on action, like, for example, Armani, Inditex have quickly reconverted to produce PPE equipment, or Louis Vuitton, Moët Hennessy to produce gel sanitizer, in the example that Parul gave during her presentation, and others like Ford, standing in the middle, they have amplified through their advertising the actions that they have taken. But it doesn't mean that the brands are in the top left corner are not communicating. They are, but through different tools. They get others to do the communication for them with PR, either through social media or traditional channels. So some brands that had been more focused on words at the very beginning of the pandemic have decided to put action over words. They have scrapped all their advertising budget, and they have refocused it on social action. This is an example of Coca-Cola. And actually, at the beginning of the week, an article was published in Marketing Week in which the CFO of Coca-Cola said, we have stopped all communication, all advertising, because we are not seeing any return on investment during the lockdown. And we see this example of BrewDog that exemplifies what I was saying, how the fact that you are focusing on actions still drives engagement. They announced that they were producing hand sanitizer at the distillery, and this drove more engagement than an ad campaign, and they sustained their engagement after that announcement. So this proves that communication of action could be as effective or more than ad campaigns during a crisis like the one we're living. So the brands that are resorting to this second type of risk mitigating strategy, improving and asking themselves how we can generate the positive impact, are basically replacing actions over words. But the problem is that a lot of brand directors equate brand investment with advertising investment. And we learned from the framework that Parul presented and that we use at Brand Finance, that we not only have one tool, which is promotion, which is what most brand managers focus on, but we also have other 3 Ps, which are product, place, price, and also CSR, always has to do with social contribution and impact. And we have seen some examples of brands that are using the other Ps in terms of commercial tools that you can use in a very creative way. So this is an example that I love, which is from an Australia retailer. They have use pricing to create value for the brand, but also signal what kind of behaviors are not desirable for the brand. So they charge $3.50 for one roll of toilet paper, $99 for 2. And I think this was a brilliant way of signaling values of brand, but also creating a huge margin for it. Another example from Poland, when in Poland, the government decreed that you had to cover your face to be in the street. The Association of Vending Machines launched this new channel, the Masko Mat, which you can buy gloves, gel sanitizers, and masks, in a vending machine, which I also thought it was a really interesting way of, distributing these products. But these are just a few examples of, how crises are opportunities for deep transformation. We know this very well in Latin America, with all the crises that we have gone through. Necessity is the mother of invention. And, I love this phrase from the past crisis from Advertising Age. They say, remarkable innovation occurs in marketing and media in the worst of the times. Like Coke, and a lot of verticals from a lot of magazines have been launched during the worst times. And So these are examples of, you know, a third strategy besides avoiding and improving, which is adjusting. You know, all of these brands have been, you know, coming up with flexible and innovative solutions for the problems that clients or non-clients are facing now. And in reality, to do this properly, you need to research, you need to monitor, you know, how preferences and consumer behaviors are changing now through different research tools. And, you know, all this comes in a context in which the expectations from different stakeholders towards brands have changed. So we have read in many surveys that, you know, now the general public, clients, non-clients, and, you know, talent has a new mandate for brands, or requires that they start by protecting its employees first. And, you know, even if it means that they have to suffer, you know, financial losses until the pandemic ends. And we have seen, you know, some brands that, you know, have started by protecting employees. You know, for example, Microsoft, and they have, you know, a policy of 12 weeks parental leave for those parents that have been trying to juggle, you know, homeschool, you know, working from home, housework. And, you know, it was a measure, besides all the other measures that Microsoft, you know, have taken, you know, to, you know, provide the technology for free to schools, etc., you know, to protect their employees and also the broader set of stakeholders. And then, you know, what these brands are doing in reality is they are absorbing a loss now. They're incurring short-term losses because they know that this is going to strengthen the brand, and in the longer term favor long-term profitability. So they're placing people over profits. But also the general public is, you know, demanding that brands, you know, extend this concept of protection, you know, to the broader society. So according to a recent survey from Edelman, 90% of the survey, the participants in the survey, the general public, is required that governments, the brands partner with governments to address the crisis, and they act as a safety net. And we are seeing that, you know, a lot of brands, you know, have gone into public and private collaboration schemes, and, you know, they have stepped in, they have, you know, used their logistic networks to transport PPE equipment for governments. They have, you know, reconverted their facilities to produce goods that are most needed during the pandemic. So they're placing the collective over the individual. They're sharing the burden of the pandemic. And, you know, on Monday, there was this article, very well written on Fast Company, that is talking about smart generosity. They're talking about the next iteration of purpose and how now is the moment of stakeholder capitalism, and that, you know, the brands that are going to be reinforced after the crisis are those that are putting all the resources, the people, the you know, the inventive products or services, the cash, towards solving this urgent issue of the pandemic. I think they're all brands that have understood that leadership in the 21st century goes well beyond the ability to generate profit, and is more related with the ability to have a positive impact on the world. So if we have to end up with, you know, what is the recipe to come out successful out of this crisis? I think there's no recipes, and all those 5 strategies that we have reviewed cannot be applied in the same extent by all companies. You know, you have to consider your individual situation, your financial situation, you know, the country you are in, to understand to which extent you can apply 1, 2, or 3 of these strategies. But all of these you have to consider in, you know, for your crisis mix, you know, which tools you can use. So it's not about how much you invest, you don't need to avoid, but how you invest. So you need to invest always thinking about improving society, the life of your clients, your employees. So it's about building reputations and not campaigns. You need to adjust, you know, and innovate with all the tools that you have in your marketing mix, and always thinking about what you can do for your clients. And for that, you need to research constantly. Then, you know, if you can absorb losses in the short term to build brand strength, and long-term profitability, and you should start by protecting your own people. And there are many ways in which you can do that, like the example of Microsoft, Comcast, Inditex in Spain. And finally, share the burden, and understanding leadership as collaboration, protection, and security. But in order to do this well, you need to measure. And at Brown Finance Institute, we have developed a myriad of courses that help our clients understand how they should measure, and how they should measure in particular, relating all those metrics to value creation, and is the best way to measure in a crisis like this, in order to justify your budget. And so, going back to the first two questions that we listed at the beginning of the presentation, the two questions that our clients tend to ask us: what should we do now, or what will happen when all of this is over? I think that those are probably not the right questions. The question that we should be asking ourselves as brand leaders is, where do we want to be in 2021? Because that is going to guide us into what actions should we undertake now to be in that position in the midterm. So thank you very much for your attention. I think we're going to move on to Q&A now.
Yes, so I've just got a few of the questions. I'm just going to pull them up and then read them out. Okay, so we have a question on whether the brand value we estimate is likely to fall less or more than market value. Gabi, I can start with this and then feel free to pitch in
Okay.
if you'd like to add. Yes, in fact, we do expect brand value to be impacted less than enterprise value, and that's purely because brands tend to be more resilient. Their brand value is much harder to build and much harder to erode, whereas market value is susceptible to a lot of market shocks and market sentiments. And as you saw in the analysis that Gabi shared earlier as well, the way in the data that we've been tracking for the last 15 years or so, it demonstrates that stronger brands are able to survive financial crises and similar shocks better. And the impact on these brand values is often less than what we see in market value. Is there anything else that you'd like to add to that, Gabi?
And I think that is related to the first, stats that we presented at the beginning, of the presentation, when we were presenting the analysis of brand finance and how stronger brands, fare better during a crisis, and probably are more likely to emerge reinforced out of a crisis, because brands are, if you will, an insurance, to the risks that you're facing during moments like this.
Okay, thanks. We have another question that is on, let me just pull that up. Shouldn't insurance companies be negatively impacted? The reason that we're seeing insurance companies negatively impacted is because they're having to pay out more. They have more claims. They're getting increasing claims from their customers in terms of, with an increase in mortality rates, increasing number of businesses that are going bust, holidays being cancelled, travel being cancelled, and that has had quite a negative impact on insurance companies. Gabi, if you see any other questions, feel free to jump in.
I think that there was one question that is, do you relate brand investment or brand equity creation with some coefficient multiplier? If so, is this unique for each firm, sector, market? We don't relate brand investment to any brand equity creation or coefficient multiplier. There are specific studies that are done in very restricted segments of very specific points in times, like the one I presented from Peter Field. Those are related to not to brand value, but rather market share and long-term profitability.
We have a question on what the impact of oil prices will be on brand value by sector. That's interesting because the sectors that demand oil the most, like transportation, airlines, have all come to a halt in this lockdown. And depending on how long these physical distancing requirements persist, presumably at some degree for the next 2 or so years, the demand in those sectors for oil will remain low, and we'd expect oil prices to remain at that level for a while. But I think what we're seeing in the oil prices is also a long-term trend and a long-term transition to people transitioning towards cleaner energy, and we've seen financial institutions investing less in oil, and they're shifting towards renewables and green tech, and that really is seen to be the future industries. And what people might in fact realize after this lockdown is they in fact like having clean air. They might not be traveling for work as often as people have been in the past, and they may persist those greener habits that we've been picking up and encourage that transition away from oil.
Okay, we did have another question before. How long do you think it will impact stock markets?
I think that's quite a difficult question to answer. It would depend on how deep a recession will be that we end up going into, and there are signs from the recovery that we're seeing in China that there can be quite a sharp recovery in some sectors, but in others, such as travel and leisure, until there is a long-term solution to the health crisis that we're dealing with, the economic impacts of that are likely to also persist for as long as that time period exists.
I think we have another question on, related to the question whether we want to be in 2021. And one of the attendees asked, my question is, if we're conforming or agreeing to the fact that the world will change drastically, does this mean that we should develop a new vision for our brands? This is a very personal view. I agree more with, of those two groups of historians or philosophers that, think about what is going to happen after the restrictions are lifted. Some of them think that the world is going to change drastically. Some others think that it's going to change for a long time, but not forever. I tend to agree more with the second group. There are some changes that this pandemic is accelerating, like robotization and artificial intelligence adoption, etc. But those are simply accelerations of trends that were already there. But it's not going to change, the basic instincts, and consumer, drivers for, purchasing. I, love one phrase of Jeff Bezos that he says, most people are obsessed with what is going to change, and what I love to think about is what's not going to change in the next 10 years in order to, set or devise my strategy. And I do think that, probably, I'm not sure about the timing or time horizon, but, in 18, 36 months, we're going to go back to what we were. So the question that we were posing, whether we want to be in 2021, is more about, what kinds of investment we should be doing now in order to strengthen our brand and to positively impact our long-term profitability. Understanding that, in the short term, things, are going to change, but, in the long term, probably we're going to go back to where we were with, more adoption of, technology and probably slight more, proportion of people working from home, but that is not going to change the fundamental basis of, consumer behavior.
Okay, thank you, Gabi. Right, so we've had another question. How can brands use the social distancing break to prepare for what happens next? Will research be too greatly affected by the lockdown, or can you do research and valuation now to prepare?
I think research and understanding where your brand stands is especially important in this climate, because we're seeing customers' perceptions being changed so rapidly. The best thing that a brand and brand managers can do at this point is to keep on top of those changing patterns that we're seeing in consumer trends, but not only to understand where you are and understand the current climate, but also to understand what consumers will continue to want out of your brand and out of the industry that you're in going forward, so that you can better prepare for a time when things do return to normal. So I think with this crisis, as Gabi mentioned early on, it will bring dramatic shifts in the way people think, the way people perceive the role of brands, what they look for, and understanding that and tracking that will be important for that bounce back.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Parul. This is the right moment, and also, and probably people are in the right circumstances to answer, to a lot of these questions. As many people are at home with not much, to do. So it's the best moment probably to tap into, those cohorts of people that are going to be more willing to answer and engage in this type of activity.
Do we have time for one more question, Zoe?
Yes, I think one more question.
Okay, I see a question on brand values only matter for big corporations and well-known brands. How can small players take advantage of the current situation? I think the one thing that we're seeing in trends is that as a lot of big companies are being overwhelmed by increasing demand, say for example in the retail grocery store sector, people are turning to alternatives. People have a greater patience for discovering new products, and as online retail becomes more prominent, the way that consumers interact with brands may completely change. And I think small players and smaller brands have a unique opportunity in this time to be able to tap into that. And valuation isn't only not only just important for big corporations. I think it's important for an organization of any size and any type to be monitoring how the brand is doing. And this doesn't just hold true for a B2C retail brand. This holds true for B2B companies, because all of the changes that we're talking about apply the same way across sectors and across different types of customers as well.
Also, to add on to what you said, Parul, there is a very nice example of a mid-size brand in Spain that produces chocolates, and the name is Chocolates Valor. And of course, their demand hadn't been greatly affected. They were a family-owned company, and last week they announced that they are raising the salaries of employees 20%. And people, when absolutely mad about the announcement, they loved it, and there are plenty of pictures in social media of people buying, 5, 10, 20 tablets of Chocolates Valor to support that initiative. So with small actions, small brands can also impact, preference, and I think there are plenty of examples of, smaller brands, taking advantage of, building brand by values and not only by value.
Okay, thank you so much. We do need to round the webinar off. It's just past 3 o'clock. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us for our first webinar of our series. Hope you found it extremely interesting. We did have quite a few questions come through through the end session, so I do apologise if we didn't get to address your question. However, if you'd like to leave any more comments or submit any core questions, please do so in the survey link that will be forwarded after the presentation, or do email any through to inquiries@brandfinance.com. Please also do keep up to date with upcoming webinars on our Brand Finance Institute website, which is brandfinanceinstitute.com. And we will, of course, be happy to keep you up to date with future events. Our next event is actually taking place on the 13th of May. So please do check the website, and we'd love to have you join us for that one too. In the meantime, thank you so much again, and again, thank you